All right. Well, thank you so much for having me come and speak. Boy, it's a tall order to ask an economist to come and cheer anyone up. I don't know if economists are usually very good at that. And I do realize now I think I'm the last thing on the agenda. So I'm the only thing standing between you and the weekend. I don't know. That puts me in a very dangerous spot. But I'm going to keep my comments to probably 2.5, 3 hours this afternoon. No, I'm just kidding. I could just see the blood draining out of your faces. I'll probably talk for half an hour, and then hopefully I can turn it over to some discussion. And if you have any questions or comments of your own, I would be delighted to hear some of those too. The title of my presentation this afternoon, Alberta in 2011, a lot of moving parts. And I was always told, if you're buying a piece of machinery or a piece of electronics or something like that, a watch, the fewer moving parts you can get in it, the better it'll probably be. It always seems to be the moving parts in any mechanism that's eventually going to give you some trouble. And the theme of my presentation these days is that right now in the global economy, there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of things going on, a lot of dynamics. And of course, Canada and Alberta, a lot of those moving parts are external to our province and our country, but we are very much impacted by what goes on around the world. What I'm going to do is sort of take us on a 35,000-foot view of a lot of these different moving parts around the global economy. Then we'll bring it all back down to how it is affecting Canada, how it will affect Alberta, how Alberta sort of fits into the global situation at the moment. And I should preface my comments with I'm not going to talk in any sort of detail about the economics of the forestry sector, only because you guys are really the experts on that. It would be a bit fraudulent for me to stand up here and talk specifically about what's going on in the forestry industry. But what I think I will do, that hopefully will provide some value, is when I talk about the global economy, the situation in the United States and in Canada, you will be able to derive your own sort of conclusions about what it's going to mean for forest products and the forest product prices in the industry that you're in. So with that, let's talk about some of these moving parts, very interesting things happening around the world. Let's talk first of all about what's going on in Japan. As the last speaker sort of alluded to, I think it's important to recognize first and foremost what's happened in Japan over the last 5 weeks is really, a human tragedy, and I think everyone sort of understands that. The tsunami and earthquake, and then the nuclear crisis in particular, really is causing a lot of very emotional and a lot of grief for people in Japan. And I do think it's important to recognize that. I guess, however, we do also need to recognize that there are economic implications about what's happened in the world's third largest economy and how that is going to affect the global economy and how it's going to affect us. Talking first of all about, the rebuilding of Japan. Well, again, as the last speaker mentioned, we do expect that there will be some upward price pressure on lumber and building materials. They've got a lot of rebuilding to do in that country, and a lot of the global supply of forest products, to the extent that Canada, we are a price taker internationally for global products, forest products. So we do expect, there to be a little bit of positive on that side. However, the other questions that come up are, Japan, the Japanese government, already the most heavily indebted government of the G8 governments and among the wealthy industrialized countries of the world. Japan's debt to GDP level is by far the highest. And the situation now as the rebuilding process begins is the Japanese government is going to be forced to be borrowing hundreds of millions of more dollars and going deeper in debt in terms of rebuilding. The question then means, well, what is this going to do for global interest rates and in places like the United States? Now, most of the Japanese government's debt is held internally. So I guess in that sense they're fortunate. They don't have a lot of foreign debt, but they do hold some foreign debt. They hold U.S. government debt. And as the Japanese government is going to be looking for more funds to rebuild, they may be in a position to repatriate some of that money that they've loaned to the Americans. They might be starting to say, hey, we need that money back. We've got some rebuilding to do here. Start to sell some of those U.S. government bonds. So far, we haven't seen a whole lot of this, but it could be the situation that Japan does need to offload some of these U.S. government securities. It starts to sell some of those, repatriate some of that money back home, which could start to push interest rates up in the United States. Now, the Federal Reserve, they've been busy like little bees trying to keep interest rates low over the last 3 years in the United States, doing a pretty good job of it. Interest rates in the United States are still kind of rock bottom. But the Federal Reserve is, they're kind of painted into a corner lately. Not only do they have no more interest rates to cut, I mean, they've been at 0 interest rates for the last year and a half, but they've been doing the only thing they have left, and that's the quantitative easing, the printing of more money, all in an effort to keep interest rates low. So far, it's, the jury's out, I guess, a bit in terms of if it's working or not. But you can say that, well, interest rates in the United States have been kept pretty low. The situation in Japan, if we start to see more nervousness globally around holding U.S. government debt, this could put the U.S. in a very, very nasty situation where, in fact, interest rates do start to rise, obviously against the will of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government. I'm not suggesting that's a probability, but it is possible that even as the U.S. is just kind of nicely coming out of recession now, and most indicators these days in the United States are not too bad. The housing market is an exception. But the U.S. is coming out of this recession, starting to post some at least moderate levels of growth. But the last thing they need right now is interest rates, sort of on that 5- and 10-year part of the interest rate spectrum, mortgage rates, to start to rise. That would be very, very counterproductive for them, and it could be one of the fallout effects from what's happened in Japan. So we'll be watching very closely over the next 6 to 12 months, in fact, how the Federal Reserve reacts to this, and in fact, if we do start to see interest rates go up in the United States prematurely. Another situation going on with the Japanese nuclear crisis is what this might mean for natural gas prices. Here we do have a situation continentally. Natural gas prices have been very, very weak for the last year or so, actually about 2 years already, and this has been the #1 problem for Alberta's economy. Natural gas is, as a fuel, I guess consumers and industrial users of gas have been enjoying low gas prices. But Alberta's economy has been very dependent on the natural gas drilling industry. And provincial government revenues have been extremely dependent on natural resource or natural gas royalties. And we're finding out now what happens for the Alberta government when, in fact, natural gas prices are low and stay low. But one of the side effects, or one of these moving parts or the dynamics of the nuclear crisis in Japan, could be higher natural gas prices in North America eventually. Not right away, but the U.S., there are nuclear, or there had been anyway, nuclear plants on their drawing boards to be developed in the U.S. to provide electricity as a way of providing, I guess, cleaner energy, trying to move away from some of their greenhouse gases, trying to reduce coal as the primary source of nuclear generation, or electricity generation. So they were looking at more nuclear. Not nearly as many as China is looking at building, but they were looking at sort of building up more nuclear energy. This has changed, the whole game now has changed for the United States because of the situation in Japan. There is going to be a lot of resistance now, and who can really blame them, for building more nuclear in Japan, or in the United States, because of what we're still seeing unfolding in Japan. 5 weeks after the disaster, and now the crisis level, or the catastrophic scale, has been raised to 7, which is the highest. It puts the Japanese situation on the same level as Chernobyl, the only other nuclear disaster to get graded that 7 in terms of catastrophe. So there's going to be a lot of resistance to new nuclear being built in the United States. No one's going to want it in their community, in their backyard, and the costs of building nuclear is going to go up significantly frankly, as even if they do want to build it or they want to allow it, there's going to be a lot more stringent code and safety requirements on these things. So I think it is a bit of a game changer for the energy industry, and I think what we could see over the next couple of years is more appetite in the United States for natural gas, more demand for natural gas. The problem for natural gas right now, why prices are so low, is that there's too much supply. You know, the shale gas plays in the U.S., they can put gas on the market for almost nothing. And actually, they're after the liquids in the natural gas now. The gas itself as a fuel is kind of a lower cost sort of side product. They want the wet gas or the liquids. But I think what we need to see is more demand for natural gas rising in the United States, and I think the situation with the nuclear, we could see more gas demand, which is eventually a positive for Alberta. If we can see these gas prices claw their way back up to around $5 or maybe $6 a BTU, we're not really close to that yet, but if we do see that, it would be at least some good news for Alberta's gas producers. Another global situation, another one of the moving parts of interest, what's going on in the Middle East? Now, we've been seeing this sort of situation unraveling for months already. This picture here was from one of the demonstrations or one of the uprisings in Egypt, in Cairo. That situation and the situation in Egypt actually sort of unfolded relatively peacefully, but we're seeing the protests moving, of course, to other countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Libya particularly in the spotlight right now, and in fact we have NATO countries sort of at war in Libya with the no-fly zone, and all kinds of turmoil and question marks being raised about what is this going to do. Are these uprisings going to switch, or I guess migrate to other Middle Eastern countries? And everyone is eyeing what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. Libya, you know, and even Egypt, not big oil producers really, but Saudi Arabia, now you're getting to be about 10% of global oil supply. And if we were to start to see uprisings and protests and turmoil in Saudi Arabia, and if it turns violent, this is going to be very negative or positive, depending on who you are, for the price of crude oil. Now again, here's where Alberta has a lot of skin in the game. High oil prices, I guess it's the opposite sort of thing as weak gas prices. These high oil prices in the last couple of years, this has been the primary reason why Alberta's economy is once again growing. Now, I know for people in this room, there is another moving part, and that's you're competing for labor with that oil sector and the energy sector. And labor shortages in the oil sector is already starting to be quite acute. But these high oil prices, overall a net benefit for Alberta, but I would suggest there's a couple of reasons why we should not be cheering these oil prices on any further. My sort of thought on it is, if we are to see these oil prices start to spike any higher, you know, $120, $140 a barrel, maybe $180 a barrel. We don't know if things really erupt in Saudi Arabia. I would suggest that at least $150 oil is not out of the question. That would be, in the short term, maybe good news for Alberta oil producers, but you just know it's going to end badly, because it is not global supply and demand driving these oil prices. Right now it is fear and it's speculation. And anytime you get fear and speculation building up in a market, just as quickly as those prices get pushed up, they can unravel and come crashing down. Just like we saw in 2008, for very different reasons in 2008. But you all remember, you know, these oil prices went soaring up to $147 a barrel, where they sat for about 15 minutes, and then they did a nosedive and came crashing down. Once all the speculators realized, well, there's actually no good reason for oil to be selling at $147 a barrel, they all bailed out, and it overcorrects on the downside, and it went far too low. $33 a barrel, where it also didn't stay for very long. But it's these kinds of wild swings in oil prices exactly what this province does not need right now. Makes it very difficult, obviously, for these oil producers to make any sensible capital plan. How do you plan around oil when it's going like this, or when it's spiking up, but everyone has a sense that, well, it's probably going to come crashing down? So instability in oil price is not good for Alberta's economy, but another reason we don't really want these oil prices any higher is obviously what it does for consumers. And we're all seeing this. We're paying the price at the pump. Just like, the province, it's a net benefit for higher oil prices, but for consumers, we get squeezed. And almost more to the point, it's what's happening to consumers in the United States. Now again, their economy still, it's coming along, but the consumer is weak in the U.S. They're dealing with high unemployment. Their housing market, as I mentioned, isn't really coming back. The last thing they need is soaring gasoline prices. If it reaches a certain point, it's not really determined exactly at what point crude oil would precipitate another recession in the United States. But, the general thought is, for each $10 rise in the price of oil, that takes off about half a percent of GDP growth in the U.S., which if you do that math, back of the envelope, if oil hits $150 a barrel, that pretty much wipes out U.S. growth this year and could even tip them back into recession. But an even more ominous outcome could be that, Americans really just wholesale do move away from hydrocarbons. It seems a little far-fetched, Americans are not just going to give up their car and start biking and walking to work, and I don't think anyone expects that. But on the other hand, sometimes dramatic shifts in mentality or big sea changes in behavior, they can happen. And I don't know if it wouldn't be out of the question if oil reaches above $150 a barrel and Americans are paying $7 a gallon. If they actually do start to say, enough is enough, we are going to figure out other ways to power our economy, other ways to get by without using so many hydrocarbons. And if they do that, they're never going to come back to hydrocarbons, not to the same extent. Which, in the longer run, you look over the next 20 years, where does that leave Alberta's economy? Where does that leave our oil sands investments if, in fact, our number one trading partner is gradually and maybe more quickly moving away from hydrocarbons altogether? So there's a few reasons here why, in fact, if we had our way in Alberta, of course we don't, but if we had our way, I think we would probably wish for these oil prices to settle back down to around $80, $70 to $80, and have some stability there. We don't have a choice in that, but oil spiking above $100 a barrel, probably not really that good news. All right, what else do we have? Food price inflation. This is another global dynamic going on at the moment. It's raising a lot of eyebrows. This woman here, maybe it's a man, it's kind of hard to tell. I guess it doesn't really matter. But she's holding her head in shock. She can't believe the prices of food. And for most places around the world, food inflation is a real worry. Now in Canada, we're fortunate. We live in a land of so much bounty that food prices or food costs are only about 9% of our disposable income, and not a big chunk of it. In other countries, Egypt, for example, talking about the uprisings there, food prices can chew up to about 50% of the average household's spending. 50%. So it's a different thing if the price of a loaf of bread increases by 50%. It goes from $2 to $3. Most Canadians, they might note that when they're grocery shopping, but they're probably still going to buy it, and they're not going to go to bed hungry. In most other places around the world, however, if the price of food increases by 50%, it could be the difference between eating and not eating. And I don't think, Canadians, we don't have really that same understanding. And because of that, food price inflation, it's not like other inflation in other items. It's not even like gasoline price inflation or inflation in things like clothes. Those things you can do without, or you can do with fewer of them. Food you actually cannot do without. So when you see food price inflation, it does tend to get kind of emotional. People are kind of passionate about it. And worst case scenario, people start to hoard food. We saw this more so in 2007, the last time we were seeing big spikes in food prices. We were, even here in Canada, but we were seeing people hoarding things like rice and all that does is cause even more shortage, which forces price up even higher. And then you get these nasty, vicious circles of food price inflation. If you look at food production around the world, the darker green countries, the United States, China, India, and Brazil, those, by the value of food produced, those are the big producers in the world. But the interesting thing is, or about this thing, I'm going to point out two countries in particular, Russia and Australia. Not the darkest of green countries. They are big agricultural producers, but by no means the largest producers in the world. But I draw attention to this because it was these two countries last year. Russia last summer with the heat and the drought and the fire and everything, and then Australia with the opposite problem with the flooding over this last winter. It was those two countries and disruptions to crops in those two countries. That's primarily what has driven food price inflation. And why is this important? Well, it's, I guess, just noteworthy that you don't need crops wiped out in places like the United States or Brazil to force food prices up. The balance of supply and demand in global food is pretty tight. So even smaller players like Russia or Australia, if there's disruptions there, you see a big spike in price. So all this comes down to what is going to happen in the growing season of 2011. I would suggest that if we have at least average global growing conditions and average yield, these food prices will probably calm down. That's one thing about the market, is that when prices are high, it gives a very good signal to producers, plant more. And they have been. I mean, everywhere around the world where you can grow anything, planting has been increasing. Trying to cash in on the higher price. So if growing conditions are at least average, there'll be greater supply, the price will calm down, everything will calm down. But if we do see another year of unusual growing conditions, more disruptions, and again, it doesn't need to be wiped out in the United States or China. Even a country like France or Australia again, or even Canada, marginal players, if we saw big disruptions there, it could be enough to send these food prices spiraling even higher. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of moving parts once again. For Alberta, well, again, we have an interest in this. We are a net food provider, and on sort of that net basis, we do enjoy the benefits of higher food prices. We export far more food products than we consume, and cash receipts for grains and oilseeds and even livestock are reaching some pretty favorable high points right now. Dare we say some of those agricultural producers are just trying to, suppress a smile on their face. Of course, anytime I speak in front of farmers, they're always quick to point out that input costs are crushing them too, which is true. I mean, fertilizer costs and fuel prices and other things like that are squeezing some of those margins. But nonetheless, if we get at least average growing conditions in Alberta this summer, it seems that we've got enough moisture. Probably now what we need is a little bit of dry and a little bit of heat to get some of those fields planted. But if we have at least average growing conditions, I think overall it should be a pretty good year for cash receipts on the farms, including livestock, and they haven't been able to say that for a little while. So again, Alberta, we are being affected by global developments. Higher food prices should translate into some pretty good news for agricultural producers this year. Finally, what is happening in Europe? Oh, the Europeans and their drama. It's always something going on there. This slide here is a little bit old, but it shows, the Greek government kind of toppling, and then Germany, the domino that's sort of backstopping, which would be normally, toppling the whole thing. And we've seen it spread to not just Germany or Greece, but also Ireland and more recently Portugal. And in the last 3 weeks, we've seen the Portuguese government defeated, a minority government defeated on a budget bill. It sounds eerily similar to another country we know about. But the situation in Portugal, their minority government defeated on an austerity budget, a bill that was trying to rein in government spending in Portugal, trying to get their house in financial order. The bill was defeated, which really raised a lot of questions about, well, what is going to happen? Shortly after their government fell, the interim government sort of threw up the red flag and said, we give up, we surrender, we come to the European Central Bank and the IMF seeking a bailout, seeking an aid package. And everyone sort of understood, well, this is going to happen. The problem is it isn't going to stop, most likely, at Portugal. We saw Greece, Ireland, Portugal. Now all eyes are turning to the bigger country, and that's Spain. What is going to happen in the Spanish economy? Their economy is doing a little bit better than it was 6 months ago, in fact. It seems that maybe they can pull up past the brink. Nonetheless, most of their banks have been downgraded in terms of solvency, and the Spanish government doesn't really yet have a credible plan in place to bring its own spending in line. So will Germany even put up with bailing out Spain? Now we're talking about a much, much larger economy than Portugal. It may not be a question of can they, it might be a question of will they. And if they don't, what might this mean for the future of the euro as a currency? This isn't a likelihood, but there's a possibility that if Spain defaults and comes to the IMF and the European Central Bank and says we need a bailout, at that point Germany bails out of the euro altogether and says we can't keep propping it up, you losers figure this out, we're reintroducing the Deutschmark because we're the only country in Europe that can, and we can't be tethered to your financial irresponsibility any longer. Again, I don't think that is what's going to happen, but it's a possibility. Again, another one of the moving parts. What could that mean for us here in Canada? Well, the Canadian dollar, we've been seeing strengthen the Canadian dollar well above par. In fact, there's only been 2 days so far this year where it's closed beneath par, and now we're seeing it well above $1.03, $1.04, and strengthening on commodity prices. And it could also strengthen even further if there is more drama in Europe around the euro. Investors are looking for stable countries, they're looking for stable currencies, and Canada is increasingly kind of fitting the bill. You know, we're not going to invest in Portugal right now. We're not going to invest in Japan. Where is left? The United States, well, that's iffy too. How about Canada? They're reasonably stable. They've got lots of commodities. Yeah, they're in the middle of an election, but they don't really have anything to talk about in this election. They fight over things like census questions, you know, not a lot of uprisings or anything like that. And it's a pretty attractive place in which to invest right now. That's helping drive up that Canadian dollar. But you see how situations, even in faraway places like Portugal, can affect us here at home with the Canadian dollar rising. The Canadian dollar, of course, that depends on who you are and which side of the fence you sit on. But it's a good news, bad news story. The bad news, of course, we're all familiar with. For exporters, it's really, really difficult with that Canadian dollar above par. And I would suggest it's probably not going to weaken anytime soon. In fact, I think it probably has more strength ahead of it, which means even more pain for exporters. Western Canada were reasonably insulated from the high dollar, from the high loonie, because generally resource prices have been strong. Natural gas being the notable exception. Who's really going to get hit by this is Central Canada, because their manufacturing base, they aren't not seeing the same sort of increase in their sale prices. In fact, if anything, they're seeing weaker sales as the U.S. consumers, they're exporting more, they're importing less, and with that dollar above par, it's going to be pretty difficult, I think, for Ontario and Quebec this year. Western Canada, again, should do a little bit better because of the high resource prices. But for exporters everywhere, it's difficult with that Canadian dollar so high. So where does all of this put Alberta? How do we fit into the whole scheme? It's actually pretty difficult right now to find a place better situated than Alberta. It's not to say that there aren't some challenges. It's not to say there aren't some storm clouds or things to worry about. We've talked about a lot of the global things going on, and certainly there's a lot of dynamics. But Alberta is, I think, in pretty good shape. We are seeing the lift from oil prices. Again, we don't want them spiking too high. We are seeing a lift from agricultural and livestock commodity prices. Natural gas is weak, but I think we are situated to perform pretty well compared to the rest of the country, and especially compared to the rest of the industrialized world. In fact, the IMF just came out, I guess the beginning of this week, with new forecasts for all of the countries of the world. They don't look at Canadian provinces, but they do suggest that in 2011, the United States and in Canada will post some of the strongest growth of the industrialized countries. Now, we're still eating the dust of the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians, but of the modern sort of developed countries, North America, Canada, and the US will outperform Europe and will outperform Japan. And within Canada, Alberta will probably post among the very best growth. So it's kind of hard right now to find a place in the developed world that is growing better right now than Alberta. It's not to say that, you know, that pockets of unemployment in Alberta, especially in southern Alberta, are still going to be felt. But we are seeing the labor market tighten up quite a lot. We're seeing labor shortages already in a lot of industries, the oil and gas industry, or oil industry particularly. I'm not sure about the forestry industry. I know you compete a lot with the energy sector. And gradually, as you sort of move north across the province, the situation improves. You know, it starts out with the attitude in Lethbridge right now is, you know, things are looking pretty good. By the time you get up to Fort McMurray, they're the only part of the province that's back to the place that they were prior to the downturn in 2008. So I think the provincial situation is looking pretty good for 2011 and going forward. Finally, I'll end on just a cute little story I heard a week or so ago. I was in a conference, and the lunch speaker was former Finance Minister John Manley, and he was relaying this cute little story he was involved in several years ago. And he was probably at a conference similar to this, and he and the group at the table, they said, well, let's make a little wager on where the Canadian dollar is going to go, because at that time the Canadian dollar was moving around. And they said, well, come back in 6 months and we'll see who was closest. So they did, and everyone put in a couple bucks or whatever the pool was and made their guesses. And in 6 months they did come back, and it turned out the one guy who got it, he was a young economist who was a PhD economist, now working for the Bank of Canada. And John Manley asked this guy, he said, how did you get it so right? How were you able to target exactly where the Canadian dollar was going to be? He says, well, Minister, I've studied all of the economic theory, and I've spent years in school and earned a PhD in economics, and I work with some of the brightest economists in the country. And all of the theory told me, you know, without doubt, that the Canadian dollar was going to go higher. So I bet it was going to go lower. And he got it right. And the story isn't so much to just kind of trash the study of economics, even though that would be one, I guess, sort of conclusion you could make. But it's an interesting story because right now, particularly, economic theory is falling short in trying to give us much guidance in where the global economy is going. It's not to say it's useless, but it is to say that all of these dynamics going on around the world, the situation in Japan and particularly the Middle East and the United States, economic theory does not have sort of a broad enough scope, I guess, to solve some of these. A lot of these issues are political, and economic theory it falls short in trying to unravel some of those mysteries. So because we do have a lot of these moving parts, it's a little bit difficult for economic theory. It can only get us so far. But I will conclude by saying that I think Canada and Alberta particularly are pretty well situated for the rest of 2011 and going into next year. And with that, I will conclude. I'll draw to your attention really quickly, if you are interested, we do at ATB Financial, my group, we prepare what we call the Daily Economic Comment. It's just a one-page, really quick and easy to read snapshot every morning, something that's going on in Alberta's economy or some nice plain language, and it's entirely free. If you go to atb.com, you can click on the box that says Daily Economic Comment. And where we try to compete, you know, we're a small financial institution, if you look at us across, compared with the big banks, but we feel our value added is kind of focusing our efforts on what's going on in this province in particular. And that's what the Daily Economic Comment is about. It's about looking at the economy from an Alberta perspective. ToddHirsch.com is just my own website that has some blogs and some other resources there. And I am on Twitter. In fact, I was just tweeting during the last presentation some interesting factoids and some interesting comments I was hearing about the labor market in the forestry sector. So if you're interested in following me on that, I usually just kind of offer a couple of interesting observations or what I'm doing that day or where I am in the province. So with that, I will conclude, and I thank you very much for your kind attention. And do we have time for questions? Or?
Sure.
or comments. If you have any comments of your own, I always love hearing those too. Yeah?
Just a quick question for you. It seems to me that if more of the dollars in the world was backed by gold or some kind of bullion, what are your thoughts? Would that help a lot of the situations right now?
Well, I can never get by one of these things without someone asking about gold or the gold standard. In theory, it would work, but there was a reason the gold standard was abandoned, and that's because it wasn't working. Everyone realized that the United States was still issuing debt. They did not have enough gold to back their obligations. So that's why the whole thing fell apart, because everyone realized, well, this is kind of a farce. You don't have enough gold. So again, in theory, it might work, but I guess you'd have to ask the question, well, what would you choose to back the currency with? Would it be gold? And if it's gold, why just gold? The price of gold moves around an awful lot, and in fact right now there's not even enough gold in the world to back all of the money that's out there. So you could say, well, gold and silver, or maybe we could add a few other commodities into that, maybe a basket of gold, silver, platinum, and let's throw oil in there. And you could imagine adding more and more commodities until what you've really got is just the global economy backing these currencies anyway. I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer. I know there's a lot of people that have some worry about, well, what's backing these currencies and what if they just collapse? It's a legitimate question, but I think at this point, going back onto something like the gold standard, it's not a practical solution. Yeah?
What's your opinion on the U.S. dollar being the reserve currency of the world? And do you think it will be under strain in the next few years? Countries already are getting away from it. What's your opinion?
Okay, so the U.S. being the global reserve currency, every now and then you hear some countries, I think France and Russia and a few others were suggesting maybe what we need is the IMF to come up with its own reserve currency, and they have what they call these special drawing rights that actually act as a global currency that's not backed by any country. It's not very liquid, or it's not traded very much, but there's been suggestions that maybe we should find another reserve currency. I guess the response to that would be, well, the international business community, they'll decide what currency they'll trade in. And right now, that is overwhelmingly still the US dollar. Now, it could be, it's probably not going to happen this year, but you could imagine maybe 10 or 20 years down the road, where international business, they are looking at other currencies. They are saying, well, what else can we trade in? What other markets are liquid enough and certain enough that, we know that government's going to be around when it comes time to cash in these obligations. Right now, there really aren't any. I mean, 5 years ago, it was looking like the euro might be. Well, not so much now. And, China, while it's a huge growing economy, their renminbi is not really an exchangeable currency, and it's still a communist country. So global business leaders are saying, well, for now, it's still the US dollar. Even though their economy is not doing good and they're printing a lot of bills, we're still reasonably certain that the US government is going to be around in 5 years or 10 years. Nothing's guaranteed. But if we lose the US government, I mean, the world's in a different situation again. And there's not really any other countries around right now where businesses are saying that is the most stable government.
Any other questions?
Looks like everyone wants out for the weekend. I don't know. If there are any questions, I can either stick around for a few minutes, or if there were any, or if there's any observations that you'd like to make. One of the things that I find valuable is when I do give these presentations to audiences like yourselves that are obviously very, very familiar with specific industries, I do really value hearing comments about what you guys are seeing in your industry and maybe some of the challenges and opportunities. So if there are any that you'd like to share now or afterwards, I'd be happy to hear those too.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you very much.